Good morning, dear students, and welcome back to our Jane Eyre lessons. Today we're going to continue the story and see what happens in Thornfield Hall after Jane went there in order to get a job. She wanted to work as a teacher for a family, and Mrs. Fairfax, she was an old, kind lady, replied to her letter at last, and she went there in order to live there and teach a girl named Adele. She was a French girl, and Jane wanted to teach her English. Adele was a nice child, and Jane immediately loved her, and Adele also loved Jane back. Also, Mrs. Fairfax was very kind to Jane. Jane liked her stay in Thornfield Hall, but she said that it was sometimes a little bit boring. Let's continue with our story and see what's happened next.
One afternoon, I walked to the village to post a letter. It was winter and there was ice on the road. As I was walking back to Thornfield Hall, I heard a noise behind me. It was a horse. A man was riding towards Thornfield Hall. I stood on one side and the horse went past. The man did not see me. He was a stranger with dark hair. Suddenly, with a loud noise, the stranger's horse fell down on the ice. The man was lying on the ground trying to get up. I ran forward to help. "Are you hurt, sir?" I asked him. The stranger looked surprised to see me. "A little," he answered. "Could you help me to catch my horse?" "That's right. Now, could you bring the horse here, please?" "Thank you." The stranger tried to stand up, but his leg was hurting too much. He looked at me again. "Could you help me to get up on its back again?" "Good. Thank you, miss." I watched him as he rode away. Who is he? I asked myself. He is not handsome, but he has an interesting face. I would like to know him. When I got back to Thornfield, everybody was very excited. Mrs. Fairfax was very busy. "What's happening?" I asked her. "Oh, Miss Eyre," said Mrs. Fairfax, "it is Mr. Rochester. He has suddenly come back, but he will probably go away again soon. Now, Miss Eyre, you must go and put on your best dress. Mr. Rochester wants to meet you and Adele after dinner." Later that evening, I took Adele to Mr. Rochester's room. I felt rather afraid of meeting Mr. Rochester. I went quietly into the room and saw a man there. I knew him. It was the man on the horse. So the interesting stranger was Mr. Rochester. Mr. Rochester did not go away again. He was busy every day, but sometimes in the evenings he talked to me. He was usually serious, and he did not smile or laugh very often, but he was interesting, and I was not afraid of him. I began to enjoy myself more at Thornfield Hall. One night, I woke up suddenly. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. I thought I heard a sound. Everything was very quiet. I listened carefully, and the sound came again. Someone was walking about outside my room. "Who's there?" I called. Nobody answered. I felt cold and frightened. The house was silent. I tried to sleep again. Then I heard a laugh. It was a terrible, cruel laugh. I listened. Someone was walking away, going up the stairs to the attic. What was happening? I decided to go and find Mrs. Fairfax. I put on some clothes and left my room.
Okay, so now students, as we know that Mr. Rochester is the owner of Thornfield hall where Adele now works. Now where Jane now works teaching Adele. So, as she mentioned that once Mr. Rochester was back, although he wasn't there most of the time, he always leaves and comes back again. And when he is ever there, he doesn't stay much in the house and he seemed serious and cold. But it was more interesting when he was around for Jane rather than the boring days where he wasn't there. So Jane found Mr. Rochester rather interesting in spite of the cold and serious attitude he has. So, why is that? Now we're going to find out. But first, let's know more about the mystery of the person walking in the silence of the night at Thornfield holds. Who could this be? And who is laughing in a cruel laugh? Okay, we have now some mystery that we need to resolve. So let's read more into the story and find out.
The house was quiet now, but suddenly I could smell smoke. Something was burning. I ran to find out. The smoke was coming from Mr. Rochester's room. I ran into the room and looked around. Mr. Rochester was asleep in his bed, and the bed was on fire. What can I do? I thought. Quickly I looked around the room. Luckily, there was some water in one corner. As quickly as I could, I took the water and threw it all over the bed. Mr. Rochester woke up. "What's happening?" he shouted. "Jane, is it you? What are you doing?" "Mr. Rochester," I said, "your bed is on fire. You must get up at once." He jumped out of bed. There was water everywhere, and the fire was still smoking. "Jane, you've saved me from the fire. How did you know about it? Why did you wake up?" Mr. Rochester asked. I told him about the noise outside my door and the terrible laugh. Mr. Rochester looked serious and angry. "I must go upstairs to the attic. Stay here and wait for me, please. Do not wake Mrs. Fairfax." He left the room, and I waited for him. At last he came back. He was still looking very serious. "You can go back to bed now, Jane. Everything is all right now." "Who lives in the attic?" I asked Mrs. Fairfax the next day. "Only Grace Poole," she answered. "She is one of the servants. She is a strange woman." I remembered Grace Poole. She was a strange, silent woman who did not often speak to the other servants. So perhaps it was Grace Poole who walked around the house late at night and laughed strangely outside the doors. That evening, when Adele finished her lessons, I went downstairs. Mrs. Fairfax met me. "Mr. Rochester left the house early this morning," she said. "He is going to stay with his friends. I think he will stay with them for some weeks. I do not know when he will come back." For several weeks, the house was very quiet again. Mr. Rochester stayed with his friends, and I continued my lessons with Adele. I did not hear the strange and terrible laugh at night again. One day Mrs. Fairfax showed me a letter from Mr. Rochester. "He is coming back," she said, "and he is bringing a lot of visitors with him. I'm going to be very busy getting everything ready. Miss Blanche Ingram is coming too. She is very beautiful." Mr. Rochester and his friends arrived. The visitors were all rich, important people. Miss Blanche Ingram was among them. She was beautiful, but very proud. Some of the visitors were nice to me, but the others did not notice me. I was too poor and unimportant. Miss Ingram never spoke to me. She was not interested in me, but she seemed to be interested in Mr. Rochester. She always seemed to enjoy her conversations with him. They often went out riding together. "I think Mr. Rochester will marry Miss Ingram," said Mrs. Fairfax. But was Mr. Rochester interested in Blanche Ingram? He seemed to like her, but he did not look very happy when they were together. One evening, a new visitor came to Thornfield Hall. He was a quiet young man with dark hair called Mr. Mason. He came to see Mr. Rochester on business. Mr. Mason told us that he and Mr. Rochester were old friends, but Mr. Rochester was not very pleased to see Mr. Mason. When Mr. Rochester heard the name Mr. Mason from the West Indies, he was surprised, and his face turned white. That night...
Okay, so this is the end of our pages for today. So what happened? Let's discuss. First of all, we learned that Mr. Rochester is the owner of Thornfield Hall, and he's not very much of a staying visitor when he comes. He always leaves, and whenever he's here, he goes out for long periods of time. But we also understand that instead of his cold and serious attitude, Jane found him interesting. One night, she heard footsteps at the silent night in Thornfield Hall, and then she heard a strange, cruel laugh. But she didn't know who was walking, and she didn't know what to do. After that, she smelled smoke, and when she ran to find out what it was, she found that Mr. Rochester's bed was on fire while he was sleeping. So she quickly poured some water on it that was in the corner of the room and managed to rescue Mr. Rochester from the burning bed, and she woke him up, and he told her that she saved his life. But then he went upstairs to the attic, and she didn't go with him. After that, when Jane was curious, she wanted to find out what was going on in the house. So she went to Mrs. Fairfax to ask her who didn't give her much information. She only told her that Grace Poole lives in the attic and she's a servant in Thornfield Hall, and Jane found her a strange woman. But there were no further information given to Jane by Mrs. Fairfax than that. After that, one week later, Mr. Rochester came back with a company of his friends. Okay, and among his friends was Blanche Ingram. She was a beautiful young lady who was interested in Mr. Rochester, and Jane started to notice that interest. Perhaps Jane felt jealous, or maybe she started to have some interesting feelings towards Mr. Rochester. This is what we're going to find out in the following pages. But for now, we're just going to learn that along the friends came another visit, a surprise visit perhaps from a gentleman called Mr. Mason from the West Indies. He said that he was an old friend to Mr. Rochester, but Jane thought otherwise because when Mr. Rochester saw him, he was surprised and alarmed when his face turned white. Now we're going to look at some questions and we're going to try and answer them together. Now let's take a look at these questions at the back of your book and let's answer them together. Are these sentences right or wrong? Jane is going to teach English to Adele, a French girl who lives in Mr. Rochester's house. Is that correct? Yes, it is correct. Jane is unhappy because Thornfield Hall is quiet and boring. Is this correct? No, it's wrong because even though sometimes it got a little boring, Jane felt happy there. After Jane helps the stranger to his feet, she wants to know him. Again, this is a wrong statement because Jane wanted to go along in her way. When Jane hears a terrible, cruel laugh outside her bedroom door, she goes out of her room and up to the attic. Is this correct? No, it's not correct since Jane didn't go up to the attic. Jane discovers the fire in Mr. Rochester's bedroom and wakes him up. This statement is true. She managed to save him from the burning bed. The servant, Grace Poole, is a strange woman who lives in the attic. Again, this is a true statement where she learned about it from Mrs. Fairfax. After Mr. Rochester goes to stay with friends, Jane hears a strange, cruel laugh again at night. No, this is wrong. She didn't hear anything strange after that night. Blanche Ingram is one of Mr. Rochester's rich, important visitors, and she is nice to Jane. Well, the first part is true, however, the rest of the sentence is wrong, so we're going to put wrong beside it since she wasn't interested at all in Jane and she didn't talk to her at all, but she was rather interested in Mr. Rochester. Now let's look at more questions. You are Jane Eyre. It is the day after the fire. You want to know about the person who lives in the attic. You want to know who walks around the house at night and why. The other student will play the role of Mrs. Fairfax. Answer Jane's question. Tell her your opinion of Grace Poole and Mr. Rochester. This is a role play that we can do together in class where you can just guess if you were Jane and something like this happened to you at night in a house that you went there to work for, and you have questions. So, what type of questions you'll have in your mind, and what exactly will you be curious to know? And the other student will play the role of Mrs. Fairfax if you work in this house and you swear to keep it secret and you found that the new employee have some questions. How will you manage to get out of the situation? How much information are you willing to give? Okay, let's answer more questions. How do these people feel? Jane about Mr. Rochester's visitors. Well, she found that they were all rich and they were interested in Mr. Rochester's company, but nobody felt interested in her. They were important, and Jane felt rather unimportant. Now let's look at B. Mr. Rochester about Blanche Ingram. Well, he didn't seem very happy while they were together. Jane has just noticed that. While she noticed that Blanche Ingram might have interest in Mr. Rochester, Rochester didn't seem to exchange the same interest in her, and he didn't feel happy with her. Mr. Rochester about Jane. Well, he felt grateful that she saved his life from the fire. Okay, and this is the end of our lesson today. Let's wait in order to learn some new interesting information while reading more pages in our story. Goodbye for now, students. See you next lesson.